Hello, and today we're going to be speaking about attention systems in the human brain.
You are about to take part in a quick experiment. Take a look at this. Okay, now, did you happen to notice anything odd? Watch again. See any changes? Don't worry if you didn't see that it's two different men. It means your brain is doing exactly what it should be. It's focusing on the meaning of the scene rather than on the irrelevant details.
So this demonstration, inspired by work from Daniel Simons and colleagues, is a great demonstration of how powerful our attention is. Our attention can quite literally make us blind to things that are perfectly available to our senses, in the sense that we will completely miss or not perceive something that is entirely obvious. So let's now hear a bit more explanation from the leader in this field, Daniel Simons, and see a couple more examples.
Inattentional blindness is the failure to notice something that's fully obvious right there in front of you when your attention is engaged on something or someone else. Change blindness is a failure to notice a difference between what's there right now and what was there a moment ago.
Scientists such as Daniel Simons from the University of Illinois have spent years devising experiments testing just how perceptive and unperceptive humans actually are.
So we feel like we're aware of everything, that we're taking in all of the details, and that if something important happens, we'll automatically notice it. It'll capture our attention. The reality is that we often don't notice unexpected things because we're aware of far less of our world than we think we are.
So how much or how little are we actually aware of? We decided to recreate one of Simon's most famous experiments to see for ourselves. Here's the setup. Our senior series producer, Vin, poses as a lost pedestrian and asks a passerby for directions.
Excuse me? I'm looking for the skyline.
Then, we break the two up, walking through them holding a large sheet of wood. Now watch as I replace Vin. You might think people would notice the switch, but almost half the time, they didn't. Of course, that means more than half the time they did. We only tried the experiment 9 times, and by no means was it good science. But we were surprised 4 people didn't notice the switch. In Simon's original experiment, 7 out of 15 people didn't either. So what determines whether or not you can figure out the switch?
When you look at another person, you encode what's relevant for what you're doing right then, in that case, giving directions, and you don't pay attention to the details that are irrelevant, say what color their shirt is or exactly how tall they are.
So here we can see that by focusing on the task, giving directions, people will quite commonly miss even extremely obvious things like who they're speaking to. So another demonstration of how powerful attention can be for our experience of the world. So by the end of this video, you will be able to describe the anatomy and the function of each of the brain's major cognitive networks. So although we're focusing on attention, attention is really such a broad term that we essentially get to cover the entire cortex in order to understand how the attention systems relate to other functions. You'll be able to distinguish between several aspects of attention and identify the cognitive networks responsible for each. And you'll be able to explain how cognitive functions like imagination and episodic memory interact with externally focused attention in the brain. So right at the beginning of the course, we gave a definition of attention, which is that attention is the mechanism by which the brain selects and enhances relevant information while filtering out distractions. So why have attention at all? Well, the problem that attention solves is that of information saturation. So not all of the sight, smells, sounds, thoughts, etc. That come in and affect our brain should guide behavior or leave a lasting imprint on your brain. That is, not everything that we experience should lead to learning and changing of your brain. So on the left, you can see a image of a brain This is the left hemisphere, and in particular we're seeing the cortex, the outside part of the brain. This is it viewed from the side, the left side. This is it viewed from the middle, as if you chopped someone's brain in half and you took the left hemisphere and you viewed it from the middle. This is from the front and this is from the back. And we can see that the brain has been coded into these 7 different colours. And we're going to focus on the 6 most important networks here. In purple, we have the visual network, whose function, unsurprisingly, is for all things vision. In blue, the somatomotor network, which is in charge of touch, movement, as well as hearing. In pink, we have the ventral attention network, which is responsible for alerting us to important things in our environment. In green, we have the dorsal attention network, and this is responsible for orienting our attention to particular parts of an image or a scene. In light orange, we have the frontoparietal network, and this network is responsible for our executive attention, so how we order and plan our cognition in order to solve tasks, as well as working memory, so how we hold and manipulate things in mind over a period of a few seconds. Then in this red colour, we have the default mode network, and this is responsible for things like episodic memory, recall, imagination, etc. Lots of functions where our attention is not focused on something in the immediate sensory environment, but actually on some thoughts coming from our brain or our mind. A few years ago, Daniel Margulies and colleagues recognized that this arrangement of cognitive networks across the brain is not random, and there is actually a seemingly consistent order of the networks. In particular, in many different parts of the brain, you will see one of the sensory networks, the somatosensory or the visual network, followed by the alerting or orienting attention networks, followed by the frontoparietal network for executive attention, and finally the default mode network for things like imagination and episodic memory. And we see that kind of general pattern, at least in these 4 different patches of different parts of the cortex. We can see that this can be arranged in this consistent ordering here with an outer ring of sensory networks, where you have vision, touch, movement, hearing. A second ring of orienting and alerting attention networks. A third ring of the frontoparietal network that's responsible for executive attention and working memory. And an inner ring that is responsible for episodic memory, recall, imagination, and related functions. So one thing that's interesting here is that the spatial organization of the cortex is such that the network responsible for recalling episodic memories and for imagining the future is physically furthest away on the surface of the cortex from the sensory input. And you see this in many different parts of the cortex. So functions that are quite detached from your senses are actually physically also quite detached from the sensory input. So now let's go through these different rings in this cortical organization, one ring at a time. So the outermost ring is the sensory networks, where we have the visual networks in purple and the somatomotor networks in blue. These are the only networks that are spatially contiguous in the cortex. That is, they are entirely one contiguous patch, and there are no islands of visual networks elsewhere according to this parcellation. And that is also true for the somatomotor network. It's one continuous patch that takes in the auditory, somatosensory, and motor networks. However, this is not all parts of the brain that are involved or somehow contribute to these sensory functions. The visual network, for example, only contains the early parts of the visual hierarchy, which we covered in other lectures. But you can think of these as areas that are more exclusively involved in visual function. And after visual information starts here, it will be sent, for example, to attention networks to process this visual information further. The somatomotor network, as we mentioned earlier, contains somatosensory information. So the human cortex is quite bumpy, and the valleys are known as sulci, or one valley is known as a sulcus, and the little hills are known as gyri, or one hill is known as a gyrus. This particular valley, this sulcus, is a good landmark to understand brain anatomy, and this is known as the central sulcus. And the touch information, the somatosensory information, goes from this central sulcus back to the rest of this blue patch here, whereas the primary motor cortex that controls the bulk of the movements of the body is from the central sulcus forward to the rest of this blue patch here, whereas auditory information, primary auditory cortex, is down here at the top of this part of the brain called the temporal lobe. We can see that's all contained within this blue somatomotor network, which contains somatosensory, motor, and auditory cortex. Now let's move in to the second ring, and this contains the alerting and orienting networks. And as with all of the four major higher cognitive networks, these attention networks are distributed across different parts of the cortex, also known as different lobes. So down here we have the temporal lobe. In the front of the brain we have the frontal lobe. Behind the frontal lobe, behind the central sulcus, we have the parietal lobe. And at the very back of the brain, where the visual cortex is, we have the occipital lobe. And the higher cognitive networks all contain areas in the temporal, parietal, and frontal lobes. So they're distributed and they're not spatially contiguous like the sensory networks. So let's look at the function of orientation of attention, or how we place our attention on some particular part of the sensory environment, like an image. We're able to do this in a way that is deliberate and from instruction. So for example, if we're told that we should attend to the top left part of an image, we are able to put our attention on that part of the image. And we can do that by moving our eyes there, but also if our eyes are fixed at another point, we can use what's called covert attention to focus our attention, our attentional spotlight, if you will, on a particular part of the image. If our eyes are on the focus of our attention, this is known as overt attention, because it's something that can be observed from the outside. But sometimes as social species, we don't necessarily want everybody to know what we're paying attention to. So we're also able to move the focus of our attention, sometimes called the spotlight of our attention, to different parts of a visual scene without necessarily moving our eyes. So this aspect of attention, where it's focused on something that is different from what our eyes are looking at, is known as covert attention. So if we're given this instruction saying that we're going to be shown an image on a screen and something important is going to happen in the top left, well, we're able to shift our attention to the top left so that we process more efficiently that part of the screen. However, that will come at a cost of processing less efficiently the rest of the image. This is known as top-down attention, because these instructions are usually processed in the frontal lobe and parts of the prefrontal cortex, and they're sent down from an area known as the frontal eye fields back down through this attention system, eventually affecting neurons in the visual network. So this is known as top down because it comes from neurons that are near the top of the cortical hierarchy down to visual neurons that are near the bottom of the cortical hierarchy. Now imagine if this image is actually a game of whack-a-mole that you might be playing on your iPad, and this is the stimulus that you see. So we were told to pay attention to the top left, but now we see these moles popping out of these circles here, and this is highly salient, something intrinsically attention grabbing about seeing things pop out of holes. So this aspect of the distinctiveness of particular parts of the image is known as the intrinsic salience of the image. So this is actually something that is a property of the thing we're looking at, and this first affects neurons near the bottom of the cortical hierarchy, and this distinctiveness information is passed up from the bottom of the cortical hierarchy through our attention network. And this, so here we have an example of top-down attention, from being instructed to focus on a particular part of the image, and what's known as bottom-up attention, which is due to some intrinsically interesting or attention-grabbing aspect of the image itself. We can think of this first top-down attention as creating a kind of instruction map that we're going to focus more on this side of the image, and we can think about this uniqueness of the different parts of the stimulus as creating a salience map. We can also learn through past experience that whenever we whack the mole in the bottom right of the screen, we tend to do particularly well and get some reward. And so this can create a value map of particular parts of space as well. And by combining these different types of top-down, bottom-up, and value maps, we can create a kind of priority map for what we should pay attention to in the whole, in the image. So this kind of top-down and bottom-up orienting of attention tends to rely most on the dorsal attention network, which was shown in green on the brain maps. So now let's delve a little bit further into how the attention system of the dorsal attention network affects our cognition. So we know that human observers are better at detecting an object in a visual scene when they know in advance something about its features. So this can be its location, like in the example we just saw, which is known as spatial attention. It can be something about its motion or its color, and these are features of the stimuli. So for example, if we know that an important object is going to be red, we can focus our attention on detecting red objects more efficiently, and that will come at the cost of detecting other colored objects less efficiently. So this involves orienting our attention to a particular location or a feature of a scene. So both this overt and covert attention are encoded in the dorsal attention network, shown here in green, and you see that as a kind of sustained activity in this green dorsal attention network. This prior expectation that allows us to better detect objects is known as a top-down attention, and that will affect how that new information is processed by sensory neurons. However, we saw in the last slide that you can also have bottom-up attention, and both of these top-down and bottom-up forms of attention act via this dorsal attention network, shown in green. It might be slightly hard to see here, but there are also some green patches here in the frontal lobe. So one interesting thing is that although the dorsal attention network can be really important for planning in some circumstances, such as tasks like this, which require planning moves in space, in visual spatial tasks. In other tasks that require planning based on internally generated thoughts, like planning how you're going to reach a goal in your own life in the future, this dorsal attention network is deactivated. So this network seems to be highly active whenever our attention needs to be on some stimuli or some features of the outside world in our current perceptual environment. However, it seems to be deactivated or inhibited whenever our attention is more on our internal thoughts, such as our memories, imagined thoughts, etc. Here we can see a result of a study by Spreng et al. So this is the same network. This is the brain shown from above. It's shown here in red. It's the same as the network shown in green in these images here. And here we can see the activity, the percent signal change. The activity goes up about 20% or more from baseline during this visual spatial planning task, but it goes way down by about 50% during an autobiographical planning task. So this kind of task I mentioned earlier, where people are trying to plan their way towards some sort of a life goal. But there is another important type of attention network that interacts heavily with the dorsal attention network, and that is the ventral attention network. So dorsal and ventral in the human brain basically mean towards the top and towards the bottom. And this ventral attention network, so the attention network that's a bit lower down in the brain, this really reacts to potentially important stimuli that are outside of the current focus of attention, such as a fire alarm. Now, I was originally going to play the fire alarm, but I realized that probably very few people would appreciate that. So you can imagine a fire alarm. So this ventral attention network, so a big part of its role is to detect these behaviorally relevant stimuli. For example, stimuli that could lead to high rewards or high punishments, but that are outside of the current focus of attention. And this could be signals from inside the body, like hunger or thirst. So, you might be doing some other task, but suddenly you realize you're really thirsty. Well, you better change your attention and go get a glass of water. It can also be social signals from the outside, like something embarrassing might have happened. Maybe you've spilled something on your nice shirt, and you better attend to that rather than finishing the point you're making. Oh, and one thing to point out that could be confusing is that this ventral attention network is also sometimes known as the salience network. So this network gets strong input from neuromodulators. In particular, we know it gets strong input from noradrenaline and also the serotonin system. Here we can see the expression of one of the main serotonin receptors on all of these cognitive networks. And shown here in this kind of light purple color is the salience network. And we can see that this salience network has the highest expression of these serotonin receptors of all of the cognitive networks. And this is in the monkey brain and this is in the human brain. But we also know that it's closely related to the function of noradrenaline. And noradrenaline is like the brain's cousin chemical of adrenaline. So noradrenaline goes up, it's very high when you're very alert, and also when you're stressed. So a little bit of noradrenaline can be great in order for cognitive functions. However, when you have too much noradrenaline and perhaps too much activation of the salience network, you can in a sense be overstimulated and it can be hard to do cognitive tasks. So this ventral attention network, also known as the salience network, this essentially works as a bit of a circuit breaker for the dorsal attention network. So imagine our dorsal attention network is focusing on something relevant to its current task. It may be focusing on a conversation that you're trying to have with the person in front of you. However, then you hear a fire alarm, and this fire alarm activates your ventral attention network, and it tells you, okay, dorsal attention network, you need to shift your focus away from that conversation and towards the alarm and getting towards an exit. So this is essentially one of the main roles of the ventral attention network. So it signals to the dorsal attention network that some important new event is happening and that it needs to reorient. It seems like that perhaps the ventral attention network does not have spatial information itself. So this is why you need to activate the dorsal attention network, which has access to a spatial map of the world and can focus. Also, activation of this ventral attention network leads to deactivation of the default mode network. So whenever this is active, it leads to a kind of inhibition of this central ring here, which we're going to get onto in more detail in a couple of minutes. So, as I mentioned briefly earlier, there is a point of potential confusion here, particularly if you read about attention in the machine learning literature. This ventral attention network is also known as the salience network. So the priority maps of visual stimuli that we looked at earlier, which is how much each part of an image stands out to us, these are calculated by the dorsal attention network, okay, not the ventral attention network, also known as the salience network. However, in the machine learning literature, the priority maps that we discussed earlier are sometimes called saliency maps. So if you see saliency map in the machine learning literature, that is probably closer to something that will be calculated by the dorsal attention network that we know in neuroscience. So you can please turn to Blackboard and answer this quiz question. So please describe how top-down and bottom-up attention interact to create a priority map for attention. Which cognitive network is principally responsible for creating this map in the brain? So now we move on from the second ring with the alerting and orienting attention networks to the third ring, which contains the frontoparietal network. And this is what we think is responsible for executive attention and also working memory function. So complex cognition requires the combination of relevant inputs, computations and outputs. They need to be assembled in the right order and relations according to the current needs. And the frontoparietal network, shown here in the light orange color, seems to be particularly important for this function. So it selects, modifies and assembles all of the different cognitive computations according to the current needs, and this is known as executive attention. Now, when these operations are performed not on stimuli that are in the current environment, but on stimuli that are stored in memory for a few seconds, this is now known as working memory. So working memory, you remember, is the function of maintaining and manipulating information in the mind. So we see that this frontoparietal network lies very close to the dorsal attention network at many different parts of the cortex, and that means that they might interact, and indeed they do, so that for many tasks that require attention on the external world, this frontoparietal network co-activates with the green dorsal attention network. If, for example, in this spatial planning task, we have to move these ovals, which are meant to be like beads, one step at a time from the starting position to this end position. This visual spatial planning task requires executive attention, and this engages both the dorsal attention network, as we saw in one of the previous slides, but also this frontoparietal network, as this requires quite complex sequencing of mental operations. And we can see in this task, this frontoparietal network increases its signal by about 25 or 30%. So this is strongly involved in this task. However, for tasks that require attention not on the external world, but on our internal thoughts, imagination, autobiographical planning, episodic memory recall, this same frontoparietal network connects or couples not with the dorsal attention network, but with the default mode network, or the innermost ring of the cortical hierarchy. And here we can see in this autobiographical planning task where people have to plan how to move towards freedom from debt. They have to plan a sequence of steps, and for this task the dorsal attention network was in fact deactivated or inhibited, but this frontoparietal network is also activated, and we see that it's activated, co-activated with this red default mode network. So we see that this frontoparietal network seems to be involved in a whole range of challenging cognitive tasks, which tells us how important that these functions of executive attention and working memory are to a wide range of cognition. So for example, this same network is involved in tasks that probe working memory, mathematics, relational reasoning, visual spatial planning, and autobiographical planning. They all activate this same network. So finally, we move right to the innermost ring, the default mode network. And this default mode network is less activated, or it's in fact deactivated or inhibited for tasks that require attention on external stimuli, compared to resting states where you're able to think about anything. In contrast, the default mode network is highly active for tasks that require attention on our internal thoughts. So tasks that require you to remember something from your life, or to imagine the future, or also to imagine others' feelings. So something where you have to generate an image or an idea or a plan of something that is not going on now in your current perceptual environment, but something that may have happened in the past, in the future, is happening to others, or perhaps is not going to happen at all. So all of these types of thoughts activate this default mode network, which is right at the other end of this cortical hierarchy from the sensory systems. So here we can see again the activity of this network is extremely high. It's increased by about 30% on these autobiographical planning tasks, and it's deactivated or inhibited for these visual spatial planning tasks. Interestingly, these default mode network regions, they develop late in our lives, in our own human development, and they also expanded a lot in evolution in the human brain compared to our close ancestor primate brains, for example. And it's thought that perhaps, by some people, that perhaps the functions of this network, which seems to be recently evolved and late developing, may be some particularly advanced human forms of thought. So perhaps some of these functions might be particularly interesting challenges for artificial intelligence to take on, to try and really understand, for example, the feelings of others or imagine various scenarios. So please now turn to the quiz at the blackboard. There's an image of the major cognitive networks in the brain. Each network is color-coded and given a letter, and I'd like you to identify, just by giving the letter, the network responsible for internally oriented attention. That is, for attention to your remembered or imagined thoughts, etc. Okay, so that's the end of today's video. So to recap, the human brain is divided into several major cognitive networks. These include the basic sensory networks, as well as dorsal and ventral attention networks, the frontoparietal network, and the default mode network. These cognitive networks are arranged in a consistent hierarchical spatial order across the cortex. This goes from the sensory networks at one end to the default mode network at the other. The dorsal attention network is responsible for orienting attention via both top-down and bottom-up mechanisms, and this essentially creates these priority maps for attention. The ventral attention network is responsible for alerting or detecting important stimuli that are outside of the current focus of attention. The frontoparietal network enables executive attention and working memory, and the default mode network is deactivated for tasks that require attention on the external world, and it's highly activated for tasks that require attention on internal thoughts. Okay, so if you are interested to read more, you can look up any of these very interesting articles, and of course you're always welcome to reach out to me for further references. Thank you very much.